we're good.
Okay, so Gavin and I are here for the final week of our class. And today we are going to wrap up Richard Wrangham's book, The Goodness Paradox, The Strange Relationship Between Virtue and Violence in Human Evolution. And today we're going to kind of pull out, as we've been doing, some of the highlights, some of the key issues that Wrangham addresses. In this case, in chapter 9 is What Domestication Did. Chapter 10 is The Evolution of Right and Wrong. Chapter 11 is Overwhelming Power. And chapter 12, he addresses war. He applies some of his ideas to war. And then finally, chapter 13, a brief chapter on the title of which is Paradox Lost. There is a brief afterword, which we've made mention of, and we'll talk very briefly about that as well. So a couple of notes. Everything seems to be continuing to go well with the discussion questions and responses to at least two other students' questions. So good job there. Everybody's turning stuff in. I mean, this is crucial. Turn stuff in, and it looks like you've thought a little bit about it. We are going to get full credit. The last thing we have remaining after for this week is the final. And before I mention that, let me just before we talk about the final, let me just step back to the final set of videos for this week. So I'm looking at, the students won't have known it yet, but they will once they see this video. Mm. Right? You're going to post them after.
Yep.
Okay. So for week 7, we're asking you to watch two brief videos and 2 somewhat longer videos, lectures. The first one is a talk by Amanda Ridley on altruism in comparative psychology, so dealing with virtue in the sense of altruism. And I think in that video she talks about several species besides humans, right? I think there is some reference to humans.
Yes. Yeah.
Then you're going to hear from David Livingstone Smith on dehumanization. That's a very brief talk, about 13 minutes. Amanda Ridley's talk is about 12 minutes. And there's 2 somewhat longer talks by Paul Bloom, who's a psychologist, an evolutionary psychologist at Yale. And the first of these talks is called Against Empathy. And the second of which is a talk called Just Babies. And this gets at evolved moral psychology. And you'll hear a lot of the similar concepts, ideas, some of the same findings that Wrangham reports, but again, from a different perspective with different samples, I think all converging on this message that, there's no doubt but that humans have evolved machinery that motivates what we can loosely call virtue, goodness, altruism. But at the same time, human evolved psychology also includes machinery that motivates nastiness, aggression, violence, and other sort of unseemly behaviors. So we're both nasty and nice, virtuous and violence. And I think that is one of the most important messages of this book. And in particular, you'll see that is the resolution to the paradox, is that it's not either or. I mean, it's not as if we are naturally violent and it's society that, sort of a culture that sort of smooths us over, nor is it the case that we are naturally good, but culture sort of jacks us up, and makes us violent. We are both virtuous and violent. We have the evolved machinery to motivate both kinds of behaviors. And this gets at Wrangham's reference to the human psychology as a chimera, as a sort of a collection of different evolved mechanisms motivating very different sets of behaviors depending on the context. So I hope you guys will enjoy those last few videos. I think they're important to watch. I think they'll help, particularly with these last few chapters, put some meat on the bones for what Wrangham is discussing. So will probably run, I would say, about an hour, Gavin. I think we can cover what we need to cover.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so chapter 9, let's see. I'm just looking back at the conclusion for chapter 8 on capital punishment. Sometimes it's useful to sort of remind yourself where he left it, well, where the author left it, in this case, where Wrangham left it. And the way he concludes the chapter on capital punishment, he says, the development of increasingly skilled language thus provides the best basis for the ultimate explanation of human domestication. As we will see in the next chapter, the consequences went far beyond a mere loss of reactive aggression. So what he wants to do in this chapter is address, his proposal that domestication in humans and in many species, but obviously his focus is on humans, that domestication in humans had many sort of cascading consequences beyond reducing reactive aggression. And he says on the first page of chapter 9, on page 168, he says, in this chapter, I want to go deeper into the argument for self-domestication to see how far we can distinguish it from alternative hypotheses for our low aggressiveness. Two have been proposed, that is, two alternative hypotheses that are worth considering in detail. One is that low reactive aggression was a feature of our ancestors much further into the deep past than 300,000 years ago. So, in other words, that we've always been, just speaking loosely, we've always been low in reactive aggression, right?
Right.
And there's nothing special to explain here, and therefore no reason to, make a big to-do about self-domestication. He's going to dispatch that alternative and suggest that that doesn't work, that indeed we are a species that expresses remarkably low reactive aggression, and therefore there is something to explain. Then he says the other alternative is that low aggression has not been directly selected, but is instead a byproduct of selection for another trait, such as increased self-control. He's going to suggest that neither does that alternative hypothesis account for or describe some of the consequences of human domestication, self-domestication. In short, he's sort of locking down his argument that it's self-domestication that has produced the relatively low reactive aggression that we see in modern humans. Relatively low, I say, because that's relative to other humans, such as Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalis, and relative to other non-human primates, including the great apes, notably chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas. So, this is obviously an important piece of his argument here, is that selection for reduced reactive aggression produced the domestication syndrome for humans.
Right.
So he's making an effort to rule out other possible explanations for what we see, or other possible descriptions for what we see in humans. Low reactive aggression, the selection against reactive aggression producing domestication.
Right. And I know in a lot of this chapter, sort of providing evidence against the hypothesis that we've just always been low on reactive aggression, he sort of sets up Neanderthals as like a comparison in place of earlier mid-Pleistocene Homo, just because there's more evidence for Neanderthals for his purposes. And I think he does a pretty good job of setting up, the at least physical evidence that Neanderthals don't seem to have undergone the domestication effect, at least to the extent that we have,
Right.
having more sexual dimorphism between males and females, more masculinized facial features, And did he I know he talked about culture, how
Yes,
Neanderthals have evidence of the same sort of cultural abilities, like body ornamentation and beads and stuff like that, but at a much
right.
lower rate than you see at uh, archaeological sites of Homo uh, groups.
Homo sapien groups or earlier Homo sapiens, for example.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's so, and that is what he's arguing that, uh, yeah, like not literally that Homo sapiens are domesticated versions of Neanderthals. He's not literally arguing that, but he's arguing it figuratively. It's a relatively speaking, yeah, as you just mentioned, Gavin, Neanderthals uh, do not have many of the features of the domestication syndrome that are displayed by humans, by modern humans, such as the various physical features you just mentioned. But what's kind of interesting is that it's not as if they're just utterly different, because as you mentioned, and as Wrangham reviews, there's very good evidence for various features of culture, and therefore various features of cooperation among Neanderthals, but just not to the same extent, not to the same, not at the same level. I mean, one possibility is that we just don't know enough about Neanderthals, and perhaps as we learn more, we'll discover that they were just as apparently culturally rich as humans. But the point he's making is really not so much focused on the presence or absence of cultural sorts of behaviors, but the relative differences in terms of the display of characteristics that indicate the domestication syndrome.
mm-hmm.
So in terms of smaller sex differences in modern humans relative to Neanderthals, more masculinized features in Neanderthals, more robust bone structure, as they call it, thicker bones, basically, for lack of a better way of saying it.
Right.
And Neanderthals, they seem to have been a more hardy, physically more robust species of humans than modern humans are.
And humans seem to be like a paedomorphic version of like young adolescent Neanderthals, I believe, also.
Yes, he spends some time making the case. And again, this is what you would expect. If humans were domesticated, okay, then if humans were domesticated, then they therefore would display the so-called domestication syndrome. And if that were true, you might expect to see, you might expect that humans would display paedomorphic sorts of traits and features. That means features that are, well, in this case, he's making the comparison again between humans and Neanderthals. And so, yes, he makes the case that humans display child or adolescent features that are, their adult features, human adult features, appear similar to the child and adolescent features of Neanderthals.
Right.
Right. That's referred to as paedomorphia or paedomorphic. Let's see, where does he specifically? Yeah, paedomorphism. So he says Homo sapiens evolved partly by paedomorphism of the brain case and face. And again, it's always relative to what? It's relative, in this case, he's making the argument that it's relative to Neanderthals.
Right.
Another very closely related Homo species. So he goes through and he's making the case that Neanderthals are not, I mean, what he wants to argue is that they are sort of a wild type version of modern humans, which means that they share many sorts of behaviors and physical traits of modern humans, but that when you step back and compare the two, you should be able to identify various features of the domestication syndrome in humans that are not found in Neanderthals. And that is the case he makes in this chapter. And in fact, he argues that one of the key sort of consequences of domestication in humans, in modern humans, is much broader, much richer cooperative behavior. Not that Neanderthals don't ever cooperate, but maybe that humans, the argument is that they're likely to have been much better at cooperating than were Neanderthals. Why? Because modern humans are much lower in reactive aggression. Okay, that's the argument he's making. It is an argument, and there's not a huge amount of data consistent. I mean, what data he does present is consistent with this argument, there's no doubt. But I think it's an area that he concedes a lot more can be done.
Okay, and this is sort of the area where he's talking about the other hypothesis that low reactive aggression is a byproduct of other favored adaptations. But I think he makes a reasonable case. I mean, it sounds reasonable, at least, for him to say that it's, more so the other way around. Like, low reactive aggression was favored first and then had, like you said, the other cascading effects.
Yeah, I mean, the argument is that it's specifically selection against reactive aggression that produces the domestication syndrome. I mean, the benefit of, the domestication syndrome argument is that, again, you're tying together all of these various features and traits and behaviors under a single process, namely domestication, rather than have to go through and explain each one of these traits or features individually. So, you got the relatively, better cooperation, the relatively smaller sex differences, the smaller face, all this stuff. All of that can be accounted for, according to Wrangham, and I think he does make a good case, more parsimoniously with reference to features of the domestication syndrome, all of which were produced by selection against reactive aggression. Right? They're all byproducts. It's a set of traits, all of which are a byproduct of selection against reactive aggression.
Right. And actually, on page 186, he does start to talk about, like, even the cooperation, like the increased ability in cooperation as a byproduct of domestication. So he talks about how domesticated versions of species are actually, they perform better on assessments of cooperation than their wild ancestors.
That's right. So the argument here is not that cooperation was actively selected for, but instead that cooperation is, a fortuitous, better ability at cooperating is a consequence, a byproduct of selection against reactive aggression. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, again, when you have a social species for which reactive aggression is selected against, well, then you're going to have a social species that now is much more tolerant of others in the group. And it's a short step from high tolerance of one another to, more efficient and effective cooperation with one another.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, and he makes reference on page 186. This is in the middle of the page. He says, domesticated animals cooperate better. That domesticated animals cooperate better than their wild ancestors is shown by research on cooperative communication. So, and he goes through and he compares dogs with wolves, so the domesticated version to the wild type version. He offers, again, a comparison of chimpanzees to bonobos, not to suggest that chimpanzees are the wild type of bonobos, but instead to suggest that bonobos are relatively domesticated compared to chimpanzees.
Yep.
And the evidence suggests that they are somewhat better at cooperating.
And I think he talked about Belyaev's foxes as well, and showed that, even though they weren't selected for, they were only selected for low reactive aggression, they weren't selected for cooperation, and yet the selected foxes were better at cooperating than the unselected line.
Right. So the crucial selective issue here is selection against reactive aggression.
Mm-hmm.
That is the explanation for the domestication syndrome, recurrent selection against reactive aggression in a social species. Okay? I mean, at some level, you could boil it down to that. Selection against reactive aggression produces the domestication syndrome. The domestication syndrome are all of those physical traits and psychological traits and social consequences, okay, that are bundled up with what happens when there's selection against reactive aggression.
Right.
According to this argument. Another one of these bundled up traits, according to Wrangham, is homosexuality, which I thought was a very interesting argument. So he says on page 189, in domesticated animals, increased cooperative ability emerges as an incidental consequence of selection against reactive aggression. Self-domestication is therefore likely to have enhanced cooperation among Homo sapiens. Then he goes on to say, but even assuming that an elevated cooperative ability began as a non-adaptive effect, that's his argument, clearly it became quickly advantageous. Cooperation was a key to Homo sapiens' domination of the earth, he says. He says, by contrast, just continuing on here on page 189, another exceptional human behavior that may have arisen from the domestication syndrome has no known adaptive functions in humans. Homosexuality is a characteristic feature of our species that, from an evolutionary perspective, remains an intriguing, unsolved puzzle. And he says a novel possibility therefore seems worth considering. If homosexual behavior is not adaptive, perhaps it evolved in humans as a pedomorphic byproduct of selection against reactive aggression. Very interesting argument, which may or may not be correct. I mean, unfortunately, anytime you apply this sort of work to humans, there's a tendency for people to get wrapped up in the politicization of these topics. But arguing that homosexuality is a byproduct of selection against reactive aggression speaks not a single word to whether or not we value homosexuality or think it's acceptable or think it's good. Okay, these are two independent issues and must be kept independent.
Yes.
There's the explanation for the behavior, and then there's the moralization of the behavior. Okay, and I think it's important to distinguish those two. So part of what I'm saying is that to argue that homosexuality is a non-adaptive byproduct of selection against reactive aggression doesn't therefore suggest that homosexuality is not an important feature of human behavior. Just the same argument was made with regard to cooperation. He's arguing that cooperation, such a crucial behavior and psychology, portion of psychology for humans, for understanding modern humans, our cooperative abilities. He's arguing that this cooperative tendency was initially a byproduct of selection against reactive aggression. Similarly, with regard to homosexuality.
Right. No, I think though that's a good point to make, and with regards to homosexuality in humans, I know a lot of researchers have sort of floundered and struggled to come up with hypotheses that hold up over time, trying to argue ways in which homosexuality itself could have been adaptive or ways it may be a byproduct of something else. But I think a byproduct of domestication is really interesting, and I think the evidence or the argument that that's the case because it is a paedomorphic trait. It's something seen typically in younger like adolescents in a species, and in domesticated versions it just kind of continues into adulthood. I think is it's interesting. I would like to see more data and more tests done on that.
Sure, and then he makes I thought, very interesting observation that in bonobos, homosexuality continues well into adulthood. It's something that you see very commonly in bonobos that you do see in chimpanzees, but only in childhood and early adolescence. Or not, maybe not only, that's too strong, but mostly in childhood and early adolescence.
Right.
And again, that's consistent with the argument that bonobos are sort of a pedomorphic variety of chimpanzees. Okay, bonobos are, he's arguing, self-domesticated. Self-domesticated relative to the figurative wild-type chimpanzees. Similarly, humans, modern humans compared to Neanderthals. Now, we don't know much about Neanderthal behavior. And I don't think that he really can't make too much of an argument with regard to the likely homosexual behavior of Neanderthals.
Right. I mean, I think he talks a little bit about how their archaeological sites show that they, existed in smaller numbers than humans, and uses that as evidence of their, lack of cooperative and therefore lack of, or higher reactive aggression. But yeah, as far as homosexual behavior, of course, they can't. He can't really speak to that.
Yeah. And I think, so certainly this is an area where there's much more to be done. And I think there's lots of room for, people to sort of cleverly design and, carry out the relevant research. So it remains open. And I think Wrangham does a good job of not giving you the impression that he's solved it.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah. Okay. Why don't we move to chapter 10, the evolution of right and wrong?
Yep, yep.
So, I think one way to summarize this is that Wrangham is arguing that to some notable or significant extent, our moral psychology, the psychology that motivates our perceptions of what is right and what is wrong, was produced by an evolutionary history of the execution of tyrannical, of tyrants, of would-be tyrants. And this is because, well, the argument is that our ancestors are those, men and women who were not executed clearly. But beyond that, what does that mean? It means that they were sensitive to the social sorts of assessments of others. They were sensitive to what does it mean to behave well? How do I behave? How do I fit in? What do I do that's acceptable? What should I avoid doing? All of that, according to Wrangham, is sort of on the path to avoiding execution. And so ultimately what he's arguing is that our moral psychology itself is a consequence of selection against reactive aggression, attributable to our ancestors' interests in not being targeted by coalition of adult males looking to keep everybody in check.
Right. And it's a really interesting way to frame human morality. And
It is.
I struggle a little bit with it, and I don't know if you did as well, only because I think it seems like not only our sense of morality, but our sense of, and I know work has been done on this, but our sense of fearing what other people think of us, and adherence to social norms seems extreme, in comparison to what Wrangham is proposing that it evolved in response to. You know what I mean? Like, it seems almost like overkill for kids in high school to be worried about what their peers think of them, compared to the environment in which our adherence to social norms and morality evolved in response to trying not to be executed.
You're saying you think that's a stretch? That our evolved psychology that our evolved psychology exists as a consequence of our ancestors successfully avoiding social targeting as outcasts?
Not entirely. I just think that I think that one selection pressure alone, I don't know, is enough to account for all of human morality. I feel like that might be too broad, but I don't know if that's necessarily what he's arguing either.
Well, my impression, I don't know either that he's intending it to be that broadly, sort of explanatory of moral psychology. I mean, that is the way it's framed. But yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just looking back at myself on this chapter. I mean, that's the crux of what he's arguing. Is
Okay.
that we can say, we can frame it as an important part, no, an important element for understanding human evolved psychology is understanding that execution by bad actors in our evolutionary past selected for our ancestors who didn't find themselves in situations where they were targeted as social outcasts or would-be bad actors.
Right.
I mean, execution eliminates the bad actors. It eliminates people who don't give a shit, who don't care about what other people think. And so what that leaves are those that do care about what others think and therefore don't find themselves in situations where they are being targeted as bad actors or ne'er-do-wells or social outcasts.
I think I like that I like that summarization a little more. Sort of focusing on, because I think the selection pressure of possibly being executed is more than sufficient to produce an adaptation where you just like feel anxiety over what other people think, and then that has the rest of the effects of social norm adherence. And I think he even starts this chapter off well with the anecdote about the Inuit guy who was executed by his own mother for just generally not caring about what people thought of him.
Right.
So,
So if one of the consequences of, a psychology that did not motivate intense concern for what others think and with reputation, I mean, if one of the recurrent features of not having those elements, right, that intense social concern was execution by coalitions of adult males in the group, well, that would by definition leave those who did have that concern.
right.
That's the broad outline. I think it's a really, really interesting argument that my sense is that it needs to be sort of unpacked, to get down in the weeds and sort of see if there's a way that we can, test, this hypothesis, with regard to specific moral emotions, for example. I mean, and I'm not sure how to go about doing that yet. I mean, I've got to think through it myself, but I think it's a very interesting argument, and on its face, seems workable. I mean, again, may be wrong, but I think it's a very interesting argument that pushes the field of moral psychology further than it currently is.
Right. And one study he mentions, I think in this chapter, is it's the ball passing game, like the virtual,
Yeah,
two people are throwing a ball back to each other, and then
right.
the one of the virtual characters in the game throws the ball to someone else other than the participant, and then the participant is like distraught and feels discluded or excluded.
Right.
And
It's
that's
very
when
intense too.
yeah, like their feelings of being excluded. You mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
After 3 minutes of cyberball, you're not even really interacting with anybody. In fact, you're not interacting with anybody. But the normal human reaction is to feel, significant, sort of exclusionary sorts of emotions. Left out, disappointed, shamed. I mean, and that has to be explained, that intense range of emotions. And go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just gonna say, I was thinking about some of the, and this is sort of the chapter where Paul Bloom's stuff becomes relevant.
Yeah,
His talk, Just Babies, is based on a book of his I read years ago
yeah,
that basically talks about the aspects of our moral psychology that are inherent and present at like basically as early as we can test for them.
right.
And one of the things I thought was interesting is like the sense of like revenge or satisfaction in seeing revenge exacted. Uh,
Yes.
I feel like that's one aspect of our morality that's really not. Uh, it doesn't seem accounted for by just selection for anxiety over what other people think. You look at
Right.
babies and they seem to enjoy it when a figure, a little cartoon thing, whatever it is set up as a bad guy and then punished for whatever it is they did. Like babies seem to, as far as we can tell, enjoy that and take some amount of pleasure in it.
Yes, and right, and that I mean, generally, what that area of work refers to third-party punishment,
Mm.
and so not only are we concerned about ourselves behaving well and not becoming the negative focus of others, but we're concerned that other people, are punished for their socially inappropriate or socially, you know, um, for breaking social rules. So we're concerned not only that we, meet the social expectations, but we're also concerned that others do. And so we spend a lot of time sort of judging and assessing what other people are doing. And then if we discover that they've done something wrong, well, then we have a very powerful, motivation to see to it that they are punished for that poor behavior. Um, and there's even work suggesting that people feel a sense of being wronged, or they feel a sense of negative sort of evaluation of others who don't punish those who have been discovered to be behaving poorly. And so we have this very rich psychology of assessing what I do, what the other person does, what other people do with regard to the other person, and so it's all of this, Wrangham is arguing, is wrapped up in an evolutionary history of execution for poor behavior. We have an intense concern with, adherence to social rules and social norms and social expectations.
Sorry, you
Craft,
were
yeah.
uh, your video like froze for a second there, and you were
Oh, sorry.
lagging behind. But I heard everything you said. But
Could you hear me? Oh, you
yep,
could hear.
yep. So the
Okay,
audio
good.
should be fine in the recording.
Okay, good. So just to look at page 221. So he's starting to wrap up this chapter. I just want to mention, again, sort of he's identifying the core issues for this chapter. And he says here, following Christopher Bem, the core idea in this chapter is that our moral psychology was forged during a period when being a social outcast was even more dangerous than it is for most people today. So he's arguing that an evolutionary history of execution for bad actors, selected, not directly, but selected indirectly. One of the cascading consequences of this is that we carry with us a psychology that is devastatingly concerned with our own social behavior, our own reputation, and the reputation of others, all of which is wrapped up in an interest in not becoming an outcast. Why? Because evolutionarily or historically, outcasts were executed,
Right.
or were at risk of it anyways. So that's a pretty bold hypothesis, that our evolutionary history of execution selected for our intense, our powerful psychology of what is right and wrong, our moral psychology.
Right.
And I don't know that I've seen, besides Bem and Wrangham, I don't know that anyone has really proposed. No one's ever, I think what's interesting about this hypothesis is that he is pinning it on an evolutionary history of execution of outcasts, an execution of would-be tyrants. I mean, that's what's interesting here, and that's what's novel.
Right. And I imagine that, otherwise people have tried to sort of assign independent explanations for different aspects of morality, and probably nothing so direct as as the execution hypothesis. I imagine.
That's right. And not even that. What you often see in the morality literature is that there's a vague reference to, and surely it's not incorrect, a vague reference to, well, our notions of right and wrong evolved because our ancestors were those who were concerned about not being subject to the costs of bad behavior. But it's a vague sort of reference to the costs of bad behavior. Losing reputation, losing status, losing resources, losing territory, losing mates. I mean, what he's arguing is that, that all may be true. Those are some of the costs of being targeted as someone who does bad stuff. But he's suggesting that the most important determinant, or a key determinant of this selective history, is, well, you could argue, the ultimate cost, being killed and being just utterly stripped of all future reproductive opportunities.
Right.
Much worse than just losing territory or mates or resources. He's proposing, and Bem has proposed, that no, what you potentially lose is your life.
And
our ancestors are those who did not lose their life.
Right. And he shows evidence from modern hunter-gatherer groups that, to sort of show that it's not that wild of an idea, because it still happens. And in a previous chapter, he talked about how capital punishment was pretty widespread in, more modern societies up until recently.
That's right, yeah. Okay, so now, is it okay if we shift to chapter 11?
Yeah.
So chapter 11 deals with what he calls overwhelming power. And really what he's getting into in this chapter is not so much selection against reactive aggression as selection in favor of coalitionary proactive aggression, right? This is this business of overwhelming power. So let's see, how does he set this up exactly? Let's see. Okay, so I'm looking at page 224. He says, we've already seen two examples of near the top of the page on page 224. We've already seen two examples of the importance of capital punishment or execution in domesticating humans and giving our moral senses. Execution is only one of many human practices of proactive violence. I mean, execution is a sort of an exemplar of proactive violence that permeate our societies and make our social lives crucially different than those of other animals. I have explained how proactive aggression appears to be responsible for virtue. In this chapter and the next, I consider its contrasting consequences. Okay? Those that show its responsibility for making humans an especially violent and despotic species. Proactive aggression gives us a key for solving the goodness paradox. Even though it made us into a calmer, gentler species, it also brought evil, according to Wrangham. So the execution hypothesis is intended to explain, in part, our domestication and our moral senses, but also he's arguing that it can help account for our very rich coalitionary proactive aggression beyond execution. And he's going to suggest an evolutionary history of execution, okay, and subsequent domestication also built a psychology that enables participation in other kinds of proactive aggression, coalitionary proactive aggression, or planned aggression, okay, including war. which he'll address in the next chapter.
Right. And I don't want to like skip over too much, but I think for me it's helpful to because it this chapter especially feels like a lot of like slow building to his main sort of point, which I feel like is the argument that selection could very well have favored increased proactive aggression. So it seems like he's sort of building the case that there would have been an adaptive advantage to humans who did in fact possess adaptations that made them more proactively aggressive, and sort of makes the argument that one less competitor from like a rival group would have typically had direct benefits for the killer in terms of reproductive opportunities or just access to food and other resources. Was that your impression?
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. So he's arguing, I mean, if you think about it, execution itself implies a psychology of coalitionary proactive aggression.
Mm.
In order to carry out an execution of a tyrannical male, there has to be some very subtle but powerful cooperation among the less powerful males, if you want to just keep it at males for now. And while females are, of course, capable of engaging in, coalitionary aggression, historically, cross-culturally, it is males that are much more likely to be involved in coalitionary proactive aggression. So, I mean, execution in and of itself, in order to perform an execution, that is for a group of males to band together, to chase down or otherwise isolate a single tyrannical male, right? So that they can exact an execution at little cost to themselves. That requires a suite of psychological mechanisms that motivate that kind of cooperative behavior.
Right.
But part of what he's arguing is so there's something peculiar, there's something special about coalitionary proactive aggression. It's operating in stealth. It's operating, with extraordinary cooperation. It's being sensitive to the context and the circumstances. I mean, all geared towards dispatching a particular individual at little or no cost to the group of individuals that make up the coalition that's inflicting this proactive aggression or execution. So this is where he talks about, so he reviews some of the historical evidence, some of the cross-cultural evidence,
Yeah.
where proactive aggression, quintessential proactive aggression are so-called raids. So where members of one tribe, let's just say tribe, in tribal cultures, hunter-gatherer cultures, they very predictably will attack, they'll work cooperatively together. They'll plan and coordinate an attack on a rival group so that the costs to them are minimized, the attackers, that is. So they'll pursue this raid, at night, under cover of darkness, when the rival members are likely to be sleeping. Why would they do that? Because they're much easier to take care of under those circumstances. They're much easier to dispatch. You can do your dirty work and then get out before things get nasty and you risk, some costs.
And does he provide
Yeah.
evidence of this kind of behavior in other animals?
Yes, and so he discusses precisely this behavior, or something that appears to be this behavior in chimpanzees. This is what chimpanzee males do. I mean, when they have the opportunities, they will patrol, their territory, the outer bounds of their territory. And if they identify a single individual, or very few relative to their numbers, from a neighboring tribe, they very frequently will act to kill that individual, okay, at very little risk to any one member of that coalition of proactive aggression. Well, he does argue that it's a different kind of, it is coordinated, it is cooperative, but it seems to be more opportunistic.
Right.
So it hasn't been planned so much as they'll patrol, and if they do happen upon a lone individual, then rather than just leave that individual alone, they will predictably attack and typically murder, kill that lone individual.
And I don't think he says it in this chapter, but this seems like another area where language would have greatly increased our ability to, plan ahead instead of just committing opportunistic, proactive aggression. And, the evidence that this does occur in chimpanzees, I think is, it lends evidence or lends support to the idea that it's really not that much of a stretch for a more advanced, better coordinated version to occur in humans,
Right. Absolutely. And he does, I don't know, yeah, I think you're right. I don't know that he's building up towards that, but he does make the case, if not in this chapter, then in the next chapter on war, that is what distinguishes the uniquely devastating proactive aggression of humans relative to any other species, is our ability to plan in excruciating detail. And how do we do that? By use of an extraordinary means of communication, namely language. Chimpanzees can't talk to each other. They can point, they can gesture, they can grunt, but they can't communicate detailed plans to one another. And Wrangham is arguing that is sort of the tipping point for modern humans, is the ability to plan, and coordinate, at a level and with detail that is simply not possible in nonverbal species. So whether we're talking about chimpanzees or wolves also engage in proactive aggression. But once again, it has the appearance of an opportunistic sort of proactive aggression. If you happen to find a lone individual from a different group, tribe, or an alternative social, a different social group. I'm trying to think of the name for a group of wolves. What is that called? Do you know, Gavin?
Is it not just a pack?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, pack.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. So, yeah, and I don't see any way around that. That is, obviously there are many distinguishing features of humans relative to chimpanzees, but the ability to plan in excruciating detail really requires a form of communication such as verbal language.
Right.
I don't know how you get around that. So at any rate, and that may account for why proactive aggression is almost entirely opportunistic in chimpanzees, where it's typically planful,
right,
rather than opportunistic in humans. All right. Now, towards the end of this chapter on overwhelming power, he makes the interesting suggestion that obedience and sovereignty are the consequences of an evolutionary history of coalitionary proactive aggression. So what he says is the advanced skills of, this is on top page 244, the advanced skills, excuse me, of proactive aggression in humans licensed forms of despotism not found in other primates. Obedience and sovereignty are potent examples. And he goes on to say, obedience is a uniquely human relationship. This, then he says, non-humans such as dogs can learn to obey, but they cannot give orders. A system of obedience depends on punishment. So part of what he's arguing here is that a psychology of obedience has evolved in humans as a consequence of, well, ultimately as a consequence of an evolutionary history of execution, but as, sort of a predictable component of, successful avoidance of or deployment of coalitionary proactive aggression. That you don't see obedience, okay, in non-humans, including in non-human primates. And similarly, let me just finish off this second example he gives. He says, sovereignty over substantial areas of land is also uniquely human. One view of sovereignty has been that the rulers and the ruled were equally involved in controlling the area in which they lived. However, that sunny perspective ignores the realities of how power is distributed. Let's see, and he goes on to say, obedience and sovereignty are not found among mobile hunter-gatherers to nearly the same extent as among settled peoples, and arguably not at all. Okay, let me push forward just a little bit further. On middle of page 246, he says, coalitionary proactive aggression is responsible for execution, war, massacre, slavery, hazing, ritual sacrifice, torture, lynchings, gang wars, political purges, and similar abuses of power. It permits sovereignty as a right over life, caste as a system of casual domination, and guards who make prisoners dig their own graves. Might as well finish this now. It's a very eloquent paragraph. It makes kings of wimps, underlies fidelity to groups, and gives us long-term tyrannies. Coalitionary proactive aggression, that is. It has battered our species since the Pleistocene. Along the evolutionary way, it brought us our great capacity for good, but it also brought enormous harm. So this business of my territory, my land, sovereignty over substantial areas of land. I mean, there are other species that are territorial, of course. So what is uniquely human about sovereignty, do you think?
I imagine he's making the argument that it's, sovereignty over not just land but people. I mean, that's not really
Yes,
something you see in other animals.
that's exactly right. Yes. It's ownership of the land and all the people in it. It's almost like, well, you can think of it as, it's only in humans that you see, as far as we know, sort of these notions of kingship and kingdom, where all and everything in it is mine. That's not something you see, not something we're aware of existing in chimpanzees, for example.
Right.
I think we know enough about Neanderthals to know the extent to which, it might be something relevant to Neanderthals. Again, I think I think these are speculations. They're interesting hypotheses. I think obedience is probably a better example than sovereignty. But nevertheless, you can see what a wide net Wrangham is casting for a history of execution. I think I appreciate the boldness of the arguments. Even if they might end up being wrong, I think it's interesting. I think they are worthwhile and interesting. Force us to think and rethink some things that we might not have thought about in that particular way.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think he sort of picks, for the next chapter, the best of these that is explained by, high proactive and low reactive aggression.
That's right. So let's move to chapter 12 on war. And he opens it by saying, humans are often said to be intensely tribal. Indeed, we are, but if tribal refers to a sense of solidarity with a large social group, the same is true of most primates. Tribalism does not distinguish us. nor does reactive aggression. And this is really the crux. It is coalitionary proactive aggression that makes our species and societies truly unusual. Again, not that other species do not engage in any kind of proactive, coalitionary aggression, but it's the arguments are muddier with regard to other species besides humans. It's
Okay.
only in humans that the argument is just rock solid, that humans engage in, coalitionary proactive aggression to an extent and with a frequency that one might as well just conclude that it's unique to humans. You know what I mean?
I think so.
I mean, you don't see, and I think we ask students to watch the uh, Yuval Noah Harari
Yep.
talk on why are humans special? And he points out, and it's an obvious thing to note, but I think it's worth pointing out, and I think Wrangham sort of trips into this as well, is that it's only in humans that you see things like slaughterhouses and concentration camps. I mean, these are all forms of coalitionary aggression, of cooperatively enacted violence and killing, okay, that does not appear, is not known in any other species. I mean, you don't see chimpanzees taking and torturing prisoners of war. It's only in humans that you see this complex coalitionary proactive aggression, cooperative aggression and violence.
Yeah, and I think it feels like this chapter is a lot of him tying other stuff together because I think it is important to consider, the selection for proactive aggression as well as
Yes.
selection against reactive aggression because that's necessary for cooperation on the scale of, human warfare. And then also, I think language is another important component to that.
Yeah, and as you were just saying that, it occurs to me that all of these can be framed as downstream incidental consequences of selection against reactive aggression, selection imposed by execution. But once you have cooperation, well, then that psychology, that behavior can in and of itself become a target of selection. Similarly, while execution may have been the initial selection pressure that produced cooperation and then subsequently proactive coalitionary aggression, once you have proactive, coalitionary aggression, that can itself become, a target for selection,
Yeah,
right?
is that what he's arguing here, or
Yes, I think so. I think he's arguing that it's that coalitionary proactive aggression has become, in and of itself, one can make the case that the psychology that motivates coalitionary proactive aggression itself, has been refined, has been built, over recent evolutionary history, but depended initially, according to Wrangham's argument, on selection against reactive aggression in the form of execution. Once you have that, well, then a whole series of cascading mechanisms, can be selected for. That's the broad outlines, I think.
yeah, yeah. But then he also one of the points of this chapter that I really liked, and that I've heard other people like David Livingstone Smith talk about, is just the extreme amount of difficulty that army generals have in actually getting people to go to war and
In
fight
modern warfare,
in modern warfare, right?
right?
Um,
Yeah,
But I mean, he presents some evidence in tribal and like hunter gatherer communities as well, where they have to work themselves up before a hunting raid, or to go attack an enemy village, or how in some communities they'll just kind of like throw projectiles at one another, like well out of range, and injuries are uncommon. So I think people have presented evidence as well that, in spite of all of this evidence for our ability to commit massive warfare against different human cultures, there's still a lot of like anxiety and reluctance on like an individual scale, not necessarily to hurt other people, but just to be hurt oneself, it seems.
Absolutely. And the thing is, he's making the argument that these are not the same behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
You got simple, what he calls simple, does he call it simple warfare and complex warfare or something? Yeah.
Yeah, he does make that distinction.
Yeah, he makes reference to two forms of warfare, simple and complex. And he concedes that complex warfare, as in modern warfare, with 18-year-old kids being sent to the front lines, who have no truck in this matter, who couldn't care less about, the general's, political aspirations or whatever. There, Wrangham is conceding that something different appears to be going on. And, people aren't invested personally at the same level as they are or ancestrally were in tribal sorts of warfare. There's something different that remains to be accounted for. And he actually makes the case that there may or may not be anything, the psychology that motivates complex warfare may well be the very same psychology that motivates participation in simple warfare. But the application of that evolved machinery to the modern context, can create problems and difficulties for generals, for example, or commanders who are attempting to manage their soldiers. It create difficulties for soldiers who don't know. While the army, for example, does their damnedest to get their soldiers to think of one another as brothers and as family members, and to some extent they're successful. I mean, that's what they're doing. They wouldn't say it like that, but they're attempting to engage evolved machinery, for tribal warfare, and to use it in a context that's very different in this modern warfare context, where there isn't a competing tribe. I mean, there are competing nations, but I mean, the competition and the rivalries are at the level of the leadership rather than the soldiers who are being deployed.
Right. Yeah. And speaking also to that, sort of using evolved machinery in a modern context, the threat of execution by your, whatever platoon members or your commanding officer, I thought was interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And if not execution, then the equivalent, which is, or the figurative equivalent, which is, being dishonorably discharged, basically.
Right.
Which can have many of the same negative impacts socially and reputationally.
Mm-hmm.
And literal execution of, traitors and those that don't do the bidding of the leadership. Wasn't that actually sorry, I just happened to have rewatched the movie You Can't Handle the Truth. What movie was that? With Jack Nicholson and Jack Nicholson gave the code red or whatever, the secretive signal for soldiers to kill another soldier who was not playing well.
Oh, I don't think I know the quote. I've never seen that movie.
Yeah. Who's the guy from Top Gun? Tom, I know it's ridiculous. I can't remember it. Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise. Yeah.
Tom Cruise is the JAG lawyer, and he's trying to get, he's trying to basically unearth this code red that was given by the general, Jack Nicholson's character, for the lower downs to kill the ne'er-do-well, to kill the guy who was causing trouble.
Okay.
Secretive, but the bottom line is, there you have it. That's execution, modern execution. Anyways, you're right. It's been literally modern execution. What was that movie called? I can't remember the name of the movie. At any rate, okay. He spent some time talking about safe killing, or killing under circumstances where one is not likely to incur costs of physical injury and death oneself.
Right.
This is on page 259, 260, in that section there. He says, in humans practicing simple warfare, as in chimpanzees and wolves, proactive aggression is the norm. The goal is to be safe, and killing tends to lead to long-term benefits for the killer. He goes on to say, selection favors safe killing whenever it can be carried out at sufficiently low risk to the attacker, sometimes even when there's no obvious benefit at stake. In an anarchic world, the satisfaction of killing an enemy can have its own rewards. I thought this was kind of a neat hypothesis here, where he's talking about killing for joy.
Oh, yeah.
Very interesting. He goes, sorry, I just backed this up a little bit. On 257, he says, the harder behavior to explain is when the act of killing is its own reward. And then going forward, he says, middle of page 257, why do they kill? The unnerving answer that makes biological sense is that they enjoy it. Evolution has made the killing of strangers pleasurable because those that like to kill tended to receive adaptive benefits. And he goes on and he says, the rewards do not have to be anticipated consciously. All that is needed is enjoyment of the kill. Sexual reproduction works in a parallel way. A chimpanzee or wolf or any other animal cannot be expected to know that an act of mating will lead to babies. Why do they mate? They enjoy it. Evolution has made sex pleasurable because those that like to mate tended to have offspring. The notion that humans evolved to enjoy killing unknown enemies is unpleasant and inimical to our ordinary view of humanity. We can hope that it will become increasingly irrelevant in the human future, given that our species is already largely unified by worldwide social connections. Unconnected enemies are already rare. Then he says, where the social divide is sufficient, however, occasional outbursts of killing still seem to manifest a deep joy of killing. Anyways, I just thought that was a very interesting observation, is that, repeatedly, historically, cross-culturally, you see what can only be understood as a pure sort of raw enjoyment of killing.
Mm-hmm. And I think the part that helped me sort of get behind the argument on 257, the paragraph below, why do they kill? At first glance, it might seem absurd. None of us would ordinarily find pleasure in killing a stranger, but strangers that any of us is likely to meet are very different from the strangers met by a warrior in a small-scale society living in an anarchic world. So I think that was helpful for me personally, because I did sort of like intuitively found it a little odd, the argument that humans would have an evolved like fondness for killing. But I think
right in and of itself.
Yeah, but I think that helped contextualize it a little bit when you think of how dangerous a member of another community would have been for ancestral humans, that,
That's right.
killing them would have provided adaptive benefits.
Right. Yes, no, I think I think there's just potentially a lot more to be done there in that area. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so the final chapter is Paradox Lost. And here's his, leads us to the argument that we talked briefly about at the opening of this discussion today, and where he proposes that human nature is a chimera, right? In other words, we are both virtuous and violent. We have psychological adaptations that motivate virtue, that is altruism, goodness, cooperation for the good, And we have adaptations that motivate violence, murder, okay, punishment. Okay? We are both virtuous and violent.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no real paradox here, so long as you don't obsess on, well, which one are we? I mean, are we at base violent or are we at base virtuous? And the answer to that is yes, both. And I think that's actually, you know, that captures the truth of the matter, even if it's muddier than one or the other.
Right. And yeah, so that I guess this sort of gets at the crux of the whole book, which is, Wrangham attempting to distinguish first between two different types of aggression, and then further arguing that both could have been, and he argues were, selected in, our ancestors' environment.
Yes,
But
and so
yeah,
we are a species that is both remarkably socially tolerant, remarkably low in notably with respect to our own group members,
right,
but capable of extraordinary violence, cooperative, proactive aggression, okay, to the extremes of, you know, modern warfare that kills millions of people, genocide, and all the rest of it. Those are all. I mean, the people that enact, extraordinary aggression and violence are people, just as much as everybody in this class. They're people with evolved machinery that, under the right or wrong circumstances, can be deployed accordingly. So we are both virtuous and violent, depending on the context, depending on the costs and benefits. And according to Wrangham, there's something, especially notable about the use of execution by coalitionary adult males to dispatch would-be tyrants. That history laid the foundation for a psychology of extraordinary virtue and a psychology of extraordinary violence.
right. And he argues here, and I think in the afterword as well, that, where traditionally the argument has been, how do we combat our inherent, evilness or tendency to be bad, we're more so fighting our inherent tendency for proactive aggression, including executions and large-scale warfare, which I think is how he sort of ends this chapter, saying that, we have a long way to go, and the opportunities available to us to deal with, bad actors and ne'er-do-wells is much greater than it was for our ancestors, whose only real option was to perform executions on, social deviants.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so he kind of closes with this notion, well, it's his perspective that, yes, I mean, in some sense, we have our ancestors, reliance on execution to account for our moral psychology. And it's a strange and unsettling idea, but that's not to say that execution or capital punishment is something to be applauded or something that we should support. He's actually arguing that we shouldn't, that time has passed for the deployment of execution or capital punishment. But there's two different things. I mean, there's the evolutionary history that built the psychology, and then there's the social sort of discussions about whether or not we should continue to execute people who, are would-be tyrants or otherwise, bad actors.
Right.
So two separate issues. Yeah. All right. Well, there we have it. I certainly enjoyed reading this book again. I hope the students enjoyed the book. I think it's an interesting set of ideas, and that is sort of a. So it's a new book, and my sort of impression is that it's going to be a book that is read for many years, and sort of because there's so many places where, the underlying psychology can be unpacked, and there's certainly a lot that we don't know. But I think it's the kind of book that I think helps me appreciate, sort of the broad range and relevance of something like animal behavior. Um, I mean, I especially appreciated, Wrangham's perspective after getting the background from Dawkins. Wrangham's perspective that is equal parts anthropology, biology, psychology, sociology, criminology. I mean, it really casts a broad net, and I think that's where some of the most interesting work is in these sort of middle zones that sort of don't fit squarely into one particular area or discipline, and that's really what the study of animal behavior is.
Okay. Um, yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay, well, very good. So Gavin will be posting the final exam on Wednesday,
Yep.
right? Um, Please let us know if you have any questions about those questions. My recollection is that there are 4 essay questions, 2 from the Dawkins book and 2 from the Wrangham book. You are welcome, as we state on the final exam itself, you're welcome to pull material from either one of the books. Please don't quote. We put it in your own words. You're welcome to rely on videos you've seen, interviews you've seen, podcasts. All of this is fair game.
Yep. What's the date today? 10th. Okay. Yeah. So, and please feel free to send drafts of your exam for feedback to me. Anywhere from when the exam is uploaded on Wednesday until Tuesday, the 18th. So basically 24 hours before the final exam is due, you can send a draft to me, and I'll give you feedback, and I'll basically tell you, this looks like an A. I don't think you need to change anything, or I'll let you know if you do. So
Perfect. Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Kevin. Right, and so the final exam will be due. Again, this is all stated right on the final exam itself, but I believe it's 3 o'clock on Wednesday, August 19th. So you'll have a full week to work on the exam, and certainly you can work with each other. You can, reach out to Gavin and I. Again, you have everything in front of you. You can use you can go back and rewatch, podcasts, re-listen to podcasts, or watch talks. I mean, for example, you might find it especially useful to, go back and rewatch a couple of the Dawkins lectures, and I think a couple of the Wrangham lectures where he sort of casts a broad net across the entire topic of the book. That might be useful. So, but at any rate, we'll look forward to hearing from you, and until then, we will be in touch. Is that right, Gavin?
sorry, what's that?
We will. We're not going to post any more discussions.
Oh,
but
right.
certainly it's available electronically.
Of course. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Thanks, Gavin.